Hello, and welcome to our APAC friendly Q&A session for our Protect Strategy meeting. This was pre-recorded. Hopefully you had a chance to see the pre-recording ahead of time. At this point, we'll open up for questions and comments. Todd, you've got the first couple here.
Yeah, sure. The first one, just to comment itself, and that is to say thank you for giving a shout out to the VR team and the video. I think giving them that sort of recognition and exposure is awesome. The second one had to do with slide 15, where in the container scanning you mentioned vulnerability matching as well as deduping of findings, and I was curious if you had explored using the tagger feature that we just got done putting into SAST, because it solves for a bit of this as well. And like I said, I realize we own the how, but I just didn't know if this was already explored or not.
Yeah, so we have not made any decisions on the how yet. We've not explored that. I'm not familiar with Tagger, so I don't really know what that offers or what problems it solves or doesn't. I know in the slides it's kind of a high level representation, so I'm happy to at least talk to the problem to be solved in a little bit more detail. There are actually a few, that's sort of a lump identifier for a few different problems that we need to solve. One of the problems that we're seeing is that by default, the scanning engines tend to spit out vulnerabilities that are unique based off of the CVE and the package name. So you get a lot of vulnerabilities with the same CVE, but different package names. And typically, that's because one package includes another package, which includes another package, which actually has a vulnerability in it. And so you get 3 vulnerabilities when really there's just one fix to be done. And so, one of the problems we have is just reducing the noise, consolidating those down so that we've got, one vulnerability per fix rather than 3 separate ones. So that would be one problem. Another problem that we have is fixing how we match against the default branch. And this one we actually have done at least an initial research spike into. We're not planning on using Tagger for that, but that's just adjusting how we resolve, like when someone does an MR against the default branch. Right now, we're not supportive of all of the different kinds of branching strategies. We assume that the customers are working in one particular way, and if they're actually releasing off of a branch that's not the default branch, our deduplication strategy there to identify which vulnerabilities are new starts to break down. So this would be, basically letting you match when you create an MR against a different branch, and you already have known vulnerabilities there that have been approved or accepted or even that just exist. This would be to compare against that and identify which ones are new versus that branch instead of new versus the default branch. So that's kind of the second problem to solve. And then there actually are a couple others. So in the longer term, we want to continue to reduce noise by identifying vulnerabilities that may exist in the code, but you don't actually use that line of code, or you don't actually use that package within the package, so to speak. And so it's a much lower priority to fix. And then the fourth area would be identifying vulnerabilities that exist, but they're out of your scope of control to fix them. So maybe you're already on the latest version of a certain package, and really the only way to fix that would be to go and contribute upstream to that particular package. So even though that's a valid vulnerability, you might want to identify that as a non-actionable or not easily actionable vulnerability so that you can focus on areas that you can actually control.
All right, cool, thank you.
So yeah, hopefully that helped, and thanks for the suggestion there. I'll be sure we at least consider Tagger and look into it as we start to explore those problems. Are there any other questions or comments for today?
I have a question. So slide 30 shows how we compare to the other providers in the market around container security, but what I what I'm not sure of is like the relative importance, like so the areas that we don't do, are they really important or not so important?
Sure. So that's a loaded question. Obviously, it varies per customer, but I think Gartner's position on this is actually fairly decent. I don't know that I 100% agree with it, but I think it's a good starting point. They have a diagram that basically creates a pyramid structure of different capabilities in the cloud workload platform protection market. And they actually rank those. They put the ones at the bottom as foundational, and the ones higher up is a little bit less important. So that's at least one framework that's been put out there by Gartner that we can reference as a starting point when we're thinking about relative importance.
Cool. And I have one more question, and I'm sorry I'm not writing. I might have a hard time writing and thinking at the same time. I know that's sad. In light of the whole security of the supply chain, are we doing anything different to have stronger ties with the managed team in terms of like having a place where we can see the policies, manage the policies, all of that are beyond container security and beyond application security? I'm just wondering, I guess my bigger question is, what are we doing to address the kind of getting ahead in the market around supply chain security?
So I'm not sure what type of policies you have in mind there. I mean, what we're doing with the security orchestration team around security policy management is really meant to be the central place in GitLab for your security and compliance policies. So I would expect that ultimately all of our security and compliance policies roll up there in that UI, but I don't know if there's a specific kind of policy that you're alluding to there.
A lot of the danger, I think, is in configurations, and configurations can fall into lots of different places. So I think it's more of a question of scope rather than approach in terms of, are we including all the pieces we need to?
If I was like reword your question, Cindy,
Please.
yeah, I think what you're asking is there collaboration across the two stages where there's overlap? And an example would be like, Sam, you've created the part of security orchestration as your policy manager, policy creator. Can't remember the exact name you gave it, but like, could that be also used as a way to tie back to compliance requirements? And then you would have a single point to kind of be like, oh, hey, all pipelines must have this run on it, which could be container scanning, or all containers deployed must have like our container host security enabled for them, and not that way. Is that kind of what you're asking,
Yes.
Cindy?
Yes.
Yeah, so if you haven't already, take a look at have you seen the video, the joint video that I put out with Sam Kerr, who's over the compliance team?
No, I haven't.
I linked to it in the description of the pre-record. That might be one to take a look at and see how we're collaborating there. So the short answer would be yes. I mean, again, we view this security policy management interface as the ultimate user experience for any type of security or compliance policy in GitLab. So that includes not just enforcing when scans have to run, but also enforcing what happens after scans complete. If they find vulnerabilities, do we then fail the pipeline or require certain approvals? Any sort of compliance task that you might want to enforce as part of a pipeline job would roll up into those policies, as well as things outside of the pipeline, like just scheduled tasks, or even your container network security or container host security. So again, that's really a big part of the charter for that security orchestration category, is to build, it's an overlay category across protect and secure and manage and really all of GitLab to provide that functionality.
I think that's great. The one part I didn't hear you say was configurations, though.
So as far as configurations, like what kind of configurations, how you configure your CI pipeline, or
Well, so if I'm a customer, I'm thinking not from the GitLab perspective, but from the customer perspective. I've got configurations for the pipeline in GitLab. I've got for my cloud provider, for my Kubernetes, for my containers. I've got lots of different levers to pull. It'd be really nice if I had one place to go that in English like language would help me configure all of that and then tell me when something's going off the rails against those policies.
yeah, so we're starting with pipeline configurations. That's kind of the closest and nearest place to GitLab and the most natural place for us to start. Some of the other types of configurations that you mentioned, like, container configuration, I think that would typically be done in like a Docker file. If you're talking about infrastructure configuration, again, that tends to be more, whether it's Ansible or Terraform or, whatever other technology that you're using. So that tends to fall more on bridging into infrastructure as code. How do you manage and protect those types of configurations?
Mhm.
In the long run, I would view that as actually being an additional SAST scan if we're talking about protecting it before it goes into production. So it'd be a SAST job that inspects that configuration, reports back, anything that's out of bounds. After it's deployed into production, you also want to make sure that things don't drift from their
Mhm.
initial configuration, right? That they stay put the way that they were originally.
Yep.
And I think that's an area that falls under protect, but it's not a funded area inside of GitLab today. So we don't have a category or a group to go focus on that. That would be a net new capability for us to go explore.
Okay. I think that's
I,
going to be important over time.
I think the question, at least the configuration part, I think is complicated in that could maybe be also enforceable by code owners as part of create. It could be part of the compliance components where there's a shadow compliance project that is enforcing things over as well. So like maybe if we rewound, if we could turn back time, if we could find a way, Cindy, like maybe the secure orchestration, to Sam's point, is more of like a manage category, and that it's eventually sticking its fingers in all the different categories and stages and whatnot. But it was born out of protect, and it was to deal with container network security, container host security.
Mhm.
And I don't think it was ever WAF rules, because I think we were done with WAF, but it became a really great thing that Sam and the team came up with, because now it's applying to secure, and now it's starting to apply to manage. And like longer term, like Gabe also wants to be able to leverage it for plan, right? So Sam might find that he's created a thing that is solving a problem, whether that's enforcement of configuration, approvals, scan execution, scan scheduling, network policies, all of it. But
Mhm.
I think it's a challenging area, because when you talk about IAC and the things that go with it, like Terraform, Sam's right, you could scan them with SAST. You can set code owners against them. You could put the configurations in that compliance thing that is now enforced via that way too, right?
Well, I think the challenge though is having it a little bit more uniformly interacted, engaged by the customer, so that they're not having to go in lots of different places or understand all the different places to go. If there's anything that we could do to simplify that, I would just keep that in mind. It may be a longer term thing, but I think that's something that they're really wrestling with. And as infrastructure as code gets even more prevalent, I think that that's going to be an even bigger problem.
Yeah, I agree. I do think that security policy management UI is that centralizing place. Even if we're not 100% there yet as a company, I think that's where we are going to put those rules when we do get there. So, again, if it's just another SaaS job, we're adding in the ability to enforce scanning jobs today in our rules editor. It'll be a very natural extension of that to say, now let's enforce this Terraform scan or this Ansible scan to make sure that, we're configuring things the way, in a way that's in line with our security compliance policies. And then again, on the production side, when or if GitLab does decide to move into that space of enforcing configuration in production, again, I think we would use that same policy editor. So even if we're not directly investing in those areas today, it is building a good foundation that's going to let us have a central place to manage all of that if we move that direction in the future.
That's terrific. Thank you for talking through it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks for the dialogue and the engagement here. Any other items related to Protect strategy worth discussing?
Ask if there's anything from your session this morning that's worth highlighting in case someone only watches the one video. If there's any questions that like Scott asked that are worth just you voicing over?
Yeah, we could do just sort of a quick recap. The first one, Scott was interested in better understanding that bridge that we're building towards the SecOps team and tangibly, how do we see ourselves getting there in terms of what's on our roadmap currently? And the answer to that would be that, over the last 3 to 6 months, we've been building a lot of what I call architectural underpinnings, just getting a good foundation in place. We've chosen to move from Claire and Clar over to Trivy because Trivy is better suited to scanning containers in production. So we're not scanning containers in production yet, but we've laid a foundation to be able to do that in the next few months. Same thing with our policy management. Even though we don't have a clean UI that we've released yet, there actually has been a lot of under the scenes, architectural work in how we interact with the CI pipeline to make sure that we're able to actually truly enforce things so that it happens every time, no matter what. So we've done a lot of that over the last 3 to 6 months. We're really reaching a tipping point here where we're shifting, from doing these architectural underpinnings to actually delivering on some of these features. So we just kicked off our research spike into Starboard to identify how to start scanning containers in production. And, we're getting close to releasing that policy UI. Both of those tangibly do help us to build the bridge over to SecOps because the AppSec persona primarily cares about vulnerabilities as they exist in code. And the SecOps team primarily is concerned with keeping the production environment secure. And so where those two overlap is vulnerabilities in code in production is really like the biggest area of overlap. So if we can start scanning containers in production, that's an area that's of joint interest to both teams. And if we can layer on security approvals and policy management as part of that, that again is only going to further facilitate the dialogue where somebody on the AppSec side says, hey, I'm going to start scanning here in production. And oh, by the way, the SecOps team might be really interested in that because they very well may have a separate tool doing that already. The second point that we talked through was just where we're headed with the alerts dashboard. Right now, there's only one type of alert that can come into there, which is the network policy alerts. So even though we've built out a good UI, practicality, its use is somewhat limited at the moment. But again, to the point of building that underlying architecture and expanding on it later, that's going to let us put other types of alerts there in the future, like, alert my infrastructure configuration changed perhaps at some point in the future, right? Or here's an alert that we just detected 5 new critical vulnerabilities as part of a regularly scheduled scan because we have some new vulnerability intelligence. Where we're headed there is just updating the UX to include a Kanban style view where you've got some swim lanes, and there's a link there in the docs that I shared this morning, but that just streamlines that workflow process as they're going through to triage those. They can easily see what's new, what's currently in review, what's been resolved, and then everything else that's either been dismissed or fully taken care of. So that may have been a little bit longer than a quick recap, but that's the summary of what went on, what we discussed this morning.
That's great. Thanks for doing that, Sam.
Cindy, did you have another question, or were you just recapping what we talked through earlier?
I was just typing it. I realized I didn't type it earlier, so putting that in there.
Great. Well, thanks for joining today. As I said in the morning session, again, I appreciate the engagement and the dialogue here. If there are more questions, feel free to reach out to me anytime, or if you prefer to discuss one-on-one for any reason, I'm happy to do that as well. So thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
Thanks, Sam.